We know that.
Has
That's why he wants to record you.
anybody ever recorded you?
Actually, many, many years ago, I was on a local cable television telling stories. But it's more years ago than I really care to think about.
Remember, some of us are older than you.
Yes, yes, and I love remembering that part.
Come on, please.
Really?
Welcome, welcome. You're here to listen to stories. This is a story called Donald the Rich and Jack the Poor, and this is a story about two brothers. This is a story from the coast of Connemara, and Donald and Jack were brothers. Donald had married sensibly. Donald had married a young lady from wealth and family. They had a fine house. They had a house that was so fine it even had a cellar underneath it, and just to class up the place a wee bit, he had gotten a cask of wine and put it in there so he could call it a wine cellar, you know. They had a stable with horses. Unfortunately, the price of most of this wealth was that Donald had to live with his mother-in-law. Jack, on the other hand, had fallen madly in love with the first orphan that his heart had settled upon, and the two of them were very happy and had many children together. Although, as you can imagine, with all of those children, they were fairly poor. Now, Jack, you know, he loved his wife and he loved his children, so he was always trying to think of ways to take care of them. You know, and make sure that they had enough to eat and they were taken care of and clothed, you know. He was a very thinking sort of man. So he was always trying to, you know, farm a bit and help people out and, you know, work here and work there and do whatever he could, even though that part of Ireland farming was more or less like it was in New England. You know, you keep moving rocks aside and you hope you find a bit of ground that you can actually plant something into, you know. But nonetheless, Jack often did, you know, the best he possibly could. And sometimes the best he possibly could wasn't quite enough. But, you know, he was such a family-feeling man. And he had been raised that way, and he figured that, you know, Donald had been raised that way, and Donald must also be a family-feeling man. And so Donald couldn't possibly mind if every once in a while Jack would help himself to one of Donald's cows. And so, you know, not to distress Donald with, you know, the signs of his poverty, every once in a while after dark, he would go up the road and help himself to one of Donald's cows, and he would bring it home and they would butcher it up and they would have a fine barbecue. And then, you know, just so that they wouldn't, you know, distress Donald with how poor they were and how hard they had to work at all of this stuff, they would bury the bones before morning. Donald and his wife and his mother-in-law had a fairly good idea of what might be going on. And they were sitting discussing the problem one day and trying to think of some way they might actually, you know, catch Jack in the act of doing this. And the mother-in-law said, I have an idea. She said, Donald, you're going to go to the market and you're going to buy a great big chest. And then you're going to drill some holes in the front of the chest, and you're going to store some meat and some supplies in the chest. And then, on some pretext or other, you're going to have Jack store the chest in that great big kitchen of his, and I'll be able to spy and see exactly what goes on there. Now, Donald could see that there were some issues with this plan. On the other hand, it involved putting his mother-in-law in a box. So I decided to go along with it. So he went to the market, he got a great big chest and he drilled some holes in the front of it, in the carving, you know. And he stood his mother-in-law in the chest, you know, with some, you know, some dried beef and you know, some jars with some water and some whiskey, you know, just in case. And then he loaded the chest up onto a cart and he took it along to Jack's house. And he said, Jack, I wonder if you could be doing me a favor. And Jack said, sure. And Donald said, well, you know, I just bought this great big chest at the market. And I brought it home. And my wife, well, you know, my wife, yes, said Jack, I know your wife. And if you listened to me in the first place, don't want to hear it, said Donald. My wife wants to rearrange the whole house and figure out where she wants the chest to go. And she'll probably end up putting it in the same place that, you know, that I had said it would go in the first place. But in the meantime, she doesn't even want the chest in the house. And I wondered if we could store it in that great big kitchen of yours until she makes up her mind, which is probably going to be the place that I chose for it in the first place. And Jack said, not a problem. We can just put it in the kitchen. And Jack and Donald picked up the chest and loaded it into Jack's kitchen. And, you know, Jack, because he was a noticing, you know, thinking kind of man, couldn't help but notice even for a great big chest, you know, for something that Donald had just bought in the market, it was a wee bit heavy for something that was supposed to be empty. So they loaded in the chest, and, you know, Jack was feeling so fine about being able to help out his brother, you know, that family feeling. And that very night he was looking at his children and wondering if they might be a little peaked looking, you know, and he decided that might be a fine evening to go and help himself to one of Donald's cows. So up the road he went, you know, after dark, and he brought home a cow and they butchered it up and they had a fine barbecue, and all the time the mother-in-law was peeping through the hidey holes watching this going on in the kitchen. You know, and then they had a fine evening, and, you know, he and his wife put his children to bed, and then they were sitting in the kitchen just talking, and, you know, that is the sign of a fine relationship when after many years and several children you can sit in the kitchen just talking to your spouse and having the finest time, you know. That is the measure of a fine relationship. That's that sign of a fine thing when you can't get the water down the right alleyway. But all this time, you know, Jack, he's a noticing, thinking kind of man, and he's been looking at that chest and he couldn't stop thinking about it. So finally he gets up, and, you know, not that he had ever done such a thing before in his life, but, you know, he's a curious thinking kind of guy. And he takes a knife and he just kind of wiggles it a little in the lock, and the lock springs open. And he opens up the chest, and there's the mother-in-law. And he was so startled he screamed. And she screamed. And it shocked him so much that he slammed down the lid and sat on it. And by now the mother-in-law is screaming and kicking and throwing up all kinds of fuss, and Jack is sitting on the chest trying to figure out what this might possibly be about. But, you know, in the meantime, the noticing kind of man, I couldn't help but notice, you know, in that chest she had some fine supplies. I mean, dried beef, you know, you can make a fine broth with that, especially for children, especially when they're ill, you know. And you know, whiskey is a good medicinal thing to have on hand. So he says to his wife, go to that cupboard over there, and all the time the mother-in-law is kicking and screaming and thrashing and thumping on the chest, and the lid is raising a little, and Jack is leaning with all his skinny weight, you know, on it. He says to his wife, go on over to that cupboard over there and get me a few empty jars. And she does. And then he gets up off the chest, he whips open the lid, he throws in the empty jars, he grabs out the supplies, he slams down the lid and locks it. By now, the mother-in-law is in full fit. She is screaming, she is thrashing, she is thumping, There is unholy wailing like a banshee loose in Jack's kitchen. The thunking alone sounds like demons on the door of hell. Jack's kitchen was an incredibly noisy place for a few days. Until it stopped. And after about a week, Donald was starting to get a bit curious. I mean, he'd been having a lovely time having a mother-in-law this week, but you know, you get a bit curious, you know, what might have been going on, and he figured it was probably time to let the old biddy, his mother-in-law, out of the box. And so he goes back and he says to Jack, you know, my wife has finally decided where the great chest should go, and of course it's, you know, where I wanted to put it in the first place. And Jack, you know, ever obliging, helps Donald load up the box on the cart, and then he's like, you know, you're gonna need just another pair of hands getting it down on the other end. So Jack goes and, you know, rides along to Donald's house down the road, and they unload the chest, and it's close to dinner time, so they invite Jack to dinner, and you know, there's leftovers after dinner, so they pack those up for Jack because, you know, leftovers are perfectly fine for children, and you know, Jack's a thinking kind of man, and you know, and then the ladies sit and they have a couple of glasses of whiskey, you know, and Jack is having a fine time talking, and all the time Donald and his wife are getting more and more curious because, you know, that box is more silent than that mother-in-law has been in all the years of the marriage. Finally, Jack, you know, walks off and walking home. And Donald and his wife open the chest, and there is the mother-in-law stone dead. And Donald looked at her. And he said to his wife, I can see clearly what happened here. Your mother, she was always a greedy person. She must have eaten and drunk up all of her supplies on the first day and starved to death. History does not record what Donald's wife thought of this theory. Nonetheless, however they come to it, in whatever manner and whatever fool plan they came up with, you know, you can't disrespect the dead. So they laid her out so people could pay their respects, you know. They waked her, which, if you're not Irish, you should understand, a wake is a party that you have to honor the dead. You know, the person is laid out, people come in and pay their respects. If you are Irish, you understand that this is free food, free booze, and usually a lot of, like, music and singing. And, you know, Donald enjoyed himself at the wake, as you would expect of a man who was, you know, finally burying a mother-in-law like that. And finally they took her down to the graveyard and they laid her in the ground, as was the custom of the country, with a small purse with some coins under her head to pay her way to the other side. And Jack, you know, helped pour his brother into bed, and then he finally went home. And you know, he started thinking, poor wee lady, dead in the ground, purse with coins under her head. It's not like she's gonna be spending it anytime soon. And you know, it might only be a few coins, but you know, he had all these children, and you gotta think of these things, you know. Leftover scraps, whatever, you know, maybe a few coins here, a few coins there, it adds up, and you got all these children to take care of. You know, a person has to think of these things. So Jack took himself off to the graveyard in the middle of the night and dug up the mother-in-law. And sure enough, under her head there was a purse with some coins in it, and he picked it up and put it in his pocket, and then he started thinking again. He loved his brother. But you know, Donald was so puffed up with pride, you know, over his wine cellar and his stable with his horses. And you know, if Donald were struck by lightning tomorrow and had to go up to the gates of heaven with a small stain of sin, of pride on his soul and got turned away, that would be a terrible thing, and Jack could not live with himself if that happened. So he decided to do something about it. So he took the dead mother-in-law.
Oh no.
And not that he had ever done such a thing before in his life, but he got into Donald's kitchen and he took the dead mother-in-law down into the wine cellar, and he sat her in a chair and he took a tankard and he tied it to her hand, and once she was settled there, he, you know, splashed some of the wine into the tankard, and then he opened the stop closure on the cask and let the rest of the wine run out on the floor. And then, considering he had done his possible best for his brother, state of his brother's soul, and, you know, a night's work well done, he went home. The next morning, Donald was in about the condition you would expect of a man who had waked a mother-in-law like that the night before. And he decided possibly the best thing for the truly amazing hangover he was sporting was possibly a hair or maybe an entire limb of the dog what had bit him the night before. So he staggered through the kitchen, he grabbed a tankard, he went down to the wine cellar, he shoved it under the tap on the wine cask and turned, and nothing happened. Now, perhaps his condition might be excused for not immediately noticing, but he fiddled with it for a bit, and then he turned, and there was his mother-in-law back from the dead, and she had the last of his wine. He was horrified and nauseated. And he went back up to his kitchen. Now, Jack, thoughtfully that morning, he thought, you know, maybe there were some leftovers from the wake, you know, that he can take home to the children. And, you know, Donald always put on a good breakfast, so why not? And he walked into the kitchen that morning and found Donald with his head in his hands, moaning, going, I can't take it. And Jack said, Donald, what's the matter? And Donald said, my mother-in-law, she's back from the dead. And Jack said, Donald, you're my brother and I love you and I'm bound to believe you, but have you been drinking?
He's Irish.
I can't, said Donald. She got the last of the wine. Well, Jack, you know, after all of this, of course, had to go down and check things out for himself, and he was forced to admit that the mother-in-law had indeed risen from the dead and appeared to indeed have the last of the wine. Nonetheless, even if they won't stay decently planted, you have to respect the dead. So they laid her out again. And they waked her again. And poor Donald was sitting there in the kitchen with his head in his hands and moaning during the wake, going, I don't know what I'm going to do. I was bad enough living with her full time, but now that she's popping back up, I think my nerves can't take this kind of thing. That's terrible. Well, said Jack, you know, Donald, I've been thinking, and I think I know why she came back. Really? Said Donald. Well, said Jack, you know, I couldn't help but notice. You know, your mother-in-law, when she was amongst the living, you know, she was used to a certain standard of living. And I couldn't help but notice when you put her in the ground, the purse that you put under her head to pay her way to the underworld, it was a bit light. I know, said Donald, but my wife, you know, I know your wife, said Jack. you listen to me in the first place. I don't want to hear it. How much do you think it would take to keep her under the sod this time? I don't know, said Jack. £10. So they finally, after the second wait, took her down to the graveyard again. Laid her in the ground, this time with a purse with 10 whole pounds. And in great relief, Donald celebrated the wake, a way a wake should be celebrated, and after Jack had poured his brother into bed, second night in a row, he went home to his wife and children and couldn't help thinking, poor wee lady, dead in the ground, 10 whole pounds under her head. 10 pounds. You know how much money 10 pounds was? How long he could feed his children on 10 pounds? I mean, it's not like she's gonna be spending it anytime soon. So Jack took himself off to the graveyard in the middle of the night and dug up the mother-in-law. And there under her head, sure enough, there was a purse with 10 whole pounds in it. I mean, a fortune in the ground could feed his children. So I picked it up and put it in his pocket, and he thought, you know, Donald is on the road, but you know, he was still awfully stuffy about those horses. If lightning struck tomorrow and Donald were struck dead and went up to the gates of heaven with a sin of pride on his soul, he would get turned back. And how ridiculous would that be? Because of horses and a stable. Really, especially when Jack could help. So he took the dead mother-in-law.
Oh no.
And not that he had ever done such a thing before in his life, of course. But he got in to Donald's stable. And you have to understand that Donald had two horses. He had a wee black mare and a great big black horse who were the best of friends. They would go into the paddock together, they would come back to the stable together. Donald was not what you would call exactly an enthusiastic rider. He only rode the wee black mare at, you know, most enthusiastic, perhaps a trot. The great black horse was strictly for show. So Jack saddled up the great black horse. He put the mother-in-law up on the horse, tied her down, and he went rustling amongst the stuff in the stable. Don't laugh, I know you got stuff in your stable too. And he found an old broken sword, tied it to her hand, and then, just in case the poor horse might feel a wee bit claustrophobic, he left the stall just on the latch so it could get out anytime it wanted. Then, feeling satisfied he had done the best he possibly could for the state of his brother's immortal soul, he went home to bed, 10 pounds in his pocket. The next morning, Donald was in about the condition you might expect of a man who had waked a mother-in-law who, well, was like that and didn't stay planted. And given that the voice of his wife was extremely irritating through the now 2-day hangover he was sporting, he decided possibly the best errand he could devise was to go into town and visit the pub and possibly replace the cask of wine that his mother-in-law had disposed of for him. So he saddled up the wee black mare and took off at a rather brisk walk. It was a fine, soft, foggy day, and of course the great black horse just knew that its stable door was on the latch and its friend the wee black mare was going somewhere. Now Donald could swear that he could keep hearing hoof prints behind him, hoofbeats. But you know, it was so foggy and you know, turning around and swiveling his head was not working so well because it might fall off at the moment. So he would try turning around and no, not so much. And it was so foggy, you know. Finally he came out into a clear place and he turned around and there was his mother-in-law back from the dead coming for him with a sword. Donald achieved speeds on his horse that he never had before, at least a brisk trot. Now Jack's house was actually on the road to town, and Jack that morning had decided that he would try and rearrange his front garden, which, you know, in this part of Ireland involved moving rocks around, hoping you find some dirt, you know, that you can plant something. And when he saw Donald riding by in an absolute lather, Donald, not the horse was kind of excited at actually getting to trot for once. He raced out into the road and said, Donald, what's the matter? And Donald said, she's back with a sword. And Donald said, Jack, you're my brother and I love you and I'm bound to believe you, but I have to ask, have you been drinking? Not since last night, Donald said, because I still haven't replaced the wine. And just then, the great big black horse, who just knew that his friend the wee mare was going on a nice little ride this morning, and they actually got to trot him trotting up. And Jack was forced to admit that the mother-in-law actually had indeed not stayed planted, and she did indeed have a sword. Well, even if they don't stay put under the sod where they're supposed to be, you can't disrespect the dead. So they took her back. They laid her out. They waked her. Poor Donald was sitting at the wake, had his head in his hands, is in tears. And Jack says, Donald, what's going on? And Donald says, I can't take it. She keeps popping up like this. My nerves are shot. I'm going to have to commit suicide. And Jack says, Donald, you know you can't do that. That's a mortal sin. He said, well, but Jack said, Donald, you know, if she just keeps coming back, I can't think, I can't breathe, I'm living in terror. Well, said Jack, you know, actually, I've been thinking. What? Said Donald, well, you know, I was thinking a while ago of going up country, you know, maybe working in the mines for a bit and sending the money back for the wife and children, you know. He says, but I'd be willing to, you know, give that up and try and help you out. I could stay here and I could guard the grave for you so she doesn't rise again. He said, but, you know, with the wife and the children, I'm really embarrassed, but I'm afraid I'd have to ask for a wee stipend. I don't care, said Donald, anything that will keep that woman permanently planted. How much do you need? I don't know, said Jack. Oh, £100 a year? Done, said Jack. And do you know, Jack guarded that grave so well that the mother-in-law never rose again. And Donald and his family with their wine cellar and, you know, their stable, they were about as happy as such people could be, but Jack and his family on a princely sum of £100 a year were the happiest family in all of Ireland. And that is Donald the Rich and Jack the Poor.